If you're new this morning and you're just now joining us for church online, thank you for watching. We're so glad to have you. We're in a series that we've entitled Fit for the Future. It's a look at the life of Elijah, and we're learning how God prepares all of us to do the things that he has planned for us to do, that he's created us to do in the days ahead. And we're looking at this time of pandemic as a time of training, as a time of preparation, that during these days and weeks, God is doing a work in us. And that work in us is going to make us stronger. It's going to make our faith more vibrant. It's going to take us to places we never imagined we'd go. And when we come out of this, we're going to see God do some amazing things as he gets us ready for the future. And as the Lord prepares us, we're at times allowed to experience things in our life that honestly are overwhelming. And that happened to Elijah. Just by way of review, we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 19. But when you come to 1 Kings 19, just a few days before what we'll read here in this chapter, Elijah had confronted 450 prophets of Baal. One solitary prophet stood against them, and he was used by God to not only confront them, but God allowed him to call down fire from heaven. It was a great victory. He had defeated his enemies, his prayers had been answered, and it appeared that the nation of Israel was now turning back to God. As well, Elijah prayed, and 3.5 years of drought was ended as God sent rain upon the land. But in a few short hours after those momentous events, Elijah found himself so discouraged, so despondent, and so depressed that he wanted to die. I mean, here's this man who was a man of great courage, a man of great faith. He was a great man of God. He was probably the last person in the land of Israel that you would expect would find himself so discouraged and so depressed that he wanted to die. And yet, as we read 1 Kings chapter 19, he exhibits many of the signs of suicide. He felt hopeless. He spoke of wanting to die. He withdrew from people. As you read through the chapter, you find him sleeping a lot. The real question is, what in the world happened to him? Let's read it in 1 Kings chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. As you come to chapter 19, Ahab now has arrived back at the palace. He tells his wicked wife, Queen Jezebel, who had hoped for good news, what Elijah had done. When she heard that he had killed her prophets, she flew into a deadly rage and she vowed to kill Elijah. At that moment, when Elijah heard that Jezebel was trying to kill him, his courage evaporated. The man who had confronted hundreds of false prophets was now running for his life. He ran 90 miles to Beersheba and then another day's journey into the desert until finally he sat down under a tree and he asked God to take his life and let him die. It's interesting to me, and I think worth pointing out, that Elijah did not take his own life. Deep down, he understood this, that suicide is a sin. Now, that's not to say that suicide is an unforgivable sin, but it is still a sin. Elijah understood that God is the giver of life. And because he's the giver of life, it's not for us to take that life. He understood that God is sovereign over life and death. That God is the one who determines when a person lives, how long they live, and when a person dies. And because of that, no one has a right to take somebody else's life or to take their own life. And yet still, like Moses, like Jeremiah, like Jonah, he wanted to die. Some of you today, as we're looking at this passage, that maybe expresses how you feel. You're facing circumstances and situations in your life, and you feel hopeless, you're tired, you're worn out, and you would like to die. You're depressed. You're in a place of despair. Maybe you don't understand why you feel this way. It's just all of the things that are a part of this season in our country and in our world. Wherever you're at and whatever you're feeling, I want you to know that God can give you hope. That just like God worked in the life of Elijah, God can work in your life to bring you to a place where you understand that you have purpose, that your life has meaning, that God has a plan for you, and that God is with you, even if right now you maybe feel that God has abandoned you. He has not left you alone. And just like he came to Elijah in the desert, God today, right now, wants to come to you. He wants to speak words of life to you. He wants to encourage you. He wants you to know that he has a purpose for your life. Now, as we look at Elijah's life, there are several reasons for his depression. Let me give you just a few. The first is unmet expectations. Here's Elijah. He had hoped for one thing, but he got another. He thought this great event of challenging the false prophets, of calling fire down from heaven, that the nation would turn to God. It looked like everything was going his way, that the nation was saved, that Queen Jezebel would be deposed. But instead, she was still ruling, and now she was trying to kill him. It wasn't supposed to be that way. It was not what he had planned for. It was not what he had hoped for. And now he was disappointed. A second reason for his depression was fear. You know, fear can cause you to become depressed. In 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 3, we read this: Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. He was so overwhelmed by fear. As we've said before, fear makes a terrible counselor. Fear pushes people down. Fear depresses people. Fear causes people to lose hope. Faith, on the other hand, and hope, on the other hand, can cause us to feel and experience the joy of the Lord, an anticipation that comes with looking forward to what God is going to do. I think another reason for his depression was isolation. Look at it in 1 Kings chapter 19 and verses 3 and 4. When he, that's Elijah, came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. No Christian can thrive or survive without fellowship and friendship. At the very moment that Elijah needed people the most, he sent his servant away. He left his servant. He separated himself from people. And do you know what it did? It made the situation worse. Somebody has said this, that loneliness and depression are Siamese twins. Where you find one, you will find the other. And there are some, and as you're listening to this today, honestly, a part of the reason for your depression is you've separated yourself from other people. I know maybe they've hurt you. I know maybe people have said things and been unkind to you. I know that maybe people have let you down, but listen, you need people. Forgive people, move forward, have friendships, have relationships. It's one of the things that is so important in doing life, and especially the Christian life. In fact, let me just encourage you. You can go online and you can get in one of our online life groups, one of our virtual life groups, and you'll find it will be such an encouragement to you. In fact, even in the comments as you're watching this message, you can just simply say, I'd like to get in a life group, and one of our pastors will respond to you, and we will help you to get involved in an online life group. It will make a difference, and it's a first step until we're all meeting together again for you to have relationships that will strengthen and encourage you. You might be saying, well, I just want to be left alone. When in fact, that's the last thing in the world you need. You need people. We all need people. We all need relationships. There's a fourth factor that I think contributed to Elijah's depression. Let's call it fatigue. Think of it. He'd run 18 to 20 miles from Mount Carmel to Jezreel, and he ran at a speed that was faster than Ahab's chariot. From there, he runs another 90 miles for his life to Beersheba, and then he goes a day and a night into the desert, and from there, he's going to travel down to Mount Horeb, or what is more well known as Mount Sinai. That entire journey is over 300 miles. So even though he's obviously a great athlete, and he's in great condition, he was on the verge of physical collapse. Can I just say this? A tired believer is a vulnerable believer. I think it's Vince Lombardi who said, fatigue makes cowards of us all. When you and I get tired, then it's going to be harder to stand firm in our faith. There is a fifth factor that I think contributed to his discouragement and depression. Let's call it self-pity. And I think of all of the causes of depression, self-pity is probably the most common cause of depression. Look at it in verse 4. He came to the broom tree. He sat down under it and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Would you notice? I've had enough. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. And I want to say, Elijah, who said you had to be better? Sometimes we get our eyes on ourselves, and we can even put expectations on ourselves that no one else is putting on us. And we're trying to live up to those, and we're thinking only of ourselves, and that's a recipe for discouragement at the very least, and depression at the worst. Look at it in verse 9. It says this, he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. Again, I just remind you how many times God is speaking to you and I. God speaks to his people over and over again. In the story of Elijah, you see it. And the word of the Lord came to him. And the word of the Lord came to him. God speaking, God talking to him. Here's the Lord's question to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. You see, he's taken his eyes off of God. He's put his eyes on himself, and all he can think about is himself. All he can think about is his own situation. All he can think about is his own dedication. He is having in that cave the ultimate pity party. Depression comes when any of us choose to just focus on ourselves. When you put your eyes on yourself, you're going to be depressed. But when we put our eyes on the Lord, what happens is there is an attendant hope and joy that God places in our heart. A lot of people, honestly, are depressed because they think way too often about themselves. how they feel, what people have done to them, what they want, what they didn't get, how life has not turned out, how people didn't do what they were supposed to do. All those things can discourage a person, and all of them are rooted really in a self-centered self-pity. It's one of the big factors that leads to depression. There's a sixth factor that I notice. Let's call this disappointment with God. Elijah was disappointed with God. Essentially, what he's saying in that cave is, God, I did my part. I did this, and I did this, and I did this, but God, you didn't do your part. I think one of the reasons why we can find ourselves depressed is when we put expectations on God because we want God to do certain things. We want him to act in a certain way. We want him to minister to us or meet us in a certain way. We expect him to do for us what maybe we saw him do in another person's life. And Elijah, he goes down to Mount Horeb, and a lot of commentators see similarities between Elijah going into the desert, going to Mount Sinai, and Moses. Now remember, Moses takes the children of Israel back in the book of Exodus to Mount Sinai, and it's at Mount Sinai that he receives the 10 Commandments. It's at Mount Sinai that they are provided with manna and they get water from the rock. And you'll notice as Elijah's going into the desert, he gets the bread that's baked over hot coals, and God has provided that for him, and he has water there to drink. And then he gets down on Mount Sinai, and it's as if he is expecting God to meet him in the same way that God met Moses. It's as if he's saying, God, if you're going to show up, I've done a lot of things, and I feel like you should do for me what you did for Moses. Remember, when Moses goes down on Mount Sinai, there's an earthquake, the mountain shakes. There's fire, the mountain is ablaze with fire. There's a strong wind. Well, as Elijah goes up on Mount Sinai, there was an earthquake, but the Bible says God wasn't in it. There was fire, but God wasn't in it. There was wind, but God wasn't in it. And then Elijah puts a cloak over his face and he goes out. And again, it's as if he's like trying to cover himself, expecting God to pass by, just like God passed by Moses, put Moses in the cleft of the rock and covered Moses and then passed by. Elijah is wanting that same kind of interaction with God. But God did something different. God, rather than giving in to Elijah's expectation, God says to him, Elijah, what are you doing here? And what he does is something no less powerful than what he did with Moses. He talks to Elijah. He has a conversation with Elijah. And in that conversation, he gives Elijah directions. Well, God wants to work in our lives, and we can, through a lot of expectations or fatigue or fear or self-pity or expecting God to do different things, we can create an environment of depression. The question maybe today for you is, well, how do I get out of it? Let me give you just some simple things that I think make a difference, and you see them in the life of Elijah. The first one is rest. If you're feeling depressed, then I'd venture to say it's because you've been pushing too hard for too long, and really you're worn out. God has established a pattern of 1 day in 7 that we rest. And that rest is not a day to work in the yard. And that rest is not a day to do chores in the house. It's a day to rest. And if you don't get that recreative day of rest, which the Bible calls a Sabbath, then the wheels will come off the car of your life. We are to work and we are to Sabbath. And if we don't Sabbath, a Sabbath will be imposed on us. So the question is not, will you Sabbath? The question is, will it be a happy or an unhappy Sabbath? Those are the options. A happy Sabbath is, it's my day off. I have time to be with God, take a nap, hang out with the family, maybe read a book. An unhappy Sabbath is, I have a heart attack, I have a nervous breakdown, and I get my rest laying in bed. I've had to learn this the hard way on more than one occasion. Some of you are pushing yourselves way too hard, you're going way too fast, and the depression you feel is simply your body, your soul, and your mind indicating that you need to slow down and you need to take a rest. Let me give you a second word for recovery: relationships. It's interesting to me, God tells Elijah, go anoint Elisha, and he will be with you. He will help you. He will be a friend to you. He will do ministry with you. God is saying, Elijah, you need a good friend. You need people around you. And here's the person I'm sending you to. Listen, again, I just encourage you, you need friends. This is why we need church. You need to be together in church. It's why when we're gathered together in church, we want people to sit close. Social distancing makes church really difficult because church was designed for people to gather and to interact with one another and to relate to one another. And it's why right now you need to be in a virtual life group. You need to have that interaction with people that will strengthen you, that will encourage you, that will help you. There's a third remedy for depression. Let's call this remember. Remember, God has a purpose for your life. Each of us were created on purpose with a purpose. Let me ask you this. Do you know what your purpose is in life? Do you know why God created you? He had a reason. He not only created you with a purpose, but he created you with gifts so that you could fulfill that purpose. My question to you is, if you don't know God's purpose, then how could you ever do it? Knowing God's purpose begins with giving your heart to Christ and then learning what God is doing on the earth, what God is doing through the church, and learning what gifts you have that he's created you with that you can use for his glory to fulfill his purpose for your life. Are you using your gifts for God's glory? Listen, there's a supernatural grace and energy that will fill your life when you begin to use your gifts for his purpose, his glory, and for the purpose for which you were created. Let me give you one last word: renew. Renew yourself by being in God's presence. Let me ask you this. Do you spend time with Jesus? Do you talk to him? That's what prayer is. Do you read his word? Do you read what he's saying to you? The primary way to know what God is saying to you and to me is by reading his word. Do you allow him to renew your soul? I love this. In Psalm 23, it says, he leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. There's something about just walking with him and being in those quiet moments that brings a soul restoration, a soul renewal, a healing, a re-energizing to your heart and to your mind. You know, my experience has been this, that God can do more for us if we'll just spend a few moments in his presence than we could do on our own by trying to strengthen ourselves. God will renew us. He'll strengthen us. He'll speak to us. He'll give us perspective. That's what Elijah needed. And honestly, that's what Jesus offers. Listen to this. In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28, Jesus said this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and the burden I give you is light. In a moment, the worship team is going to come back, and they're going to sing a beautiful song that I think will encourage you. It's called I Speak Jesus. And I think you're going to find as you hear that song and as you're in the presence of the Lord there in your home or wherever you're watching this from, you're going to sense the Lord minister to you. But before we close, I want to ask this question to everybody who's listening. Have you given your heart to Jesus? I mean, especially if you're in the midst of a season where you feel scared or freaked out or agitated, here's what you need to do. You need to call out to God. The Bible says this, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But you have to call. It's a decision only you can make for you. No one else can do it for you. And right now, God is speaking to your heart. The question is, will you respond? Let me ask you this question. If this were your last day on planet Earth, if tomorrow you were entering eternity, where would you spend it? Would you go to heaven or would you go to hell? The fact of the matter is, hell is a real place. It's a place where people go who didn't want anything to do with God in this life, and so they'll spend eternity separated from Him in the next life. It's a place where people will go who did not allow Jesus to forgive their sins and pay the penalty for their sins. Listen, this is why Jesus came to earth. For God so loved the world that He sent His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. He came to pay for our sin. There's an old song that says, He paid a debt He did not owe, because I owed a debt I could not pay. Jesus right now is knocking on the door of your heart. He wants you to open your heart to Him. He wants you to invite Him into your life. And when you do, He will not only forgive your sin, but His power will change you into a new person.